The day of Grandpa's 90th birthday was supposed to feel like a milestone, a celebration of his long life, and a gathering of family bound by love and respect for the man who held us together. The house had been decorated days in advance, balloons clinging to the ceiling, banners across the walls, tables lined with food carefully prepared by relatives who wanted everything to be perfect. As soon as I walked in, I noticed the warmth of the setting, children running around with plates of cake, uncles already gathered in one corner arguing about politics, and a group of aunts bustling near the kitchen. Yet, beneath the cheerful exterior, something about the atmosphere felt heavier than it should have. It wasn't the kind of heaviness that could be explained by age, worry, or exhaustion. It was more like the unspoken weight that lingers when a room is filled with people who know something they're not ready to say. Faces wore smiles, but not the kind that reached the eyes. Laughter rang out, but there were pauses in between, moments where silence hung too long before someone broke it with a forced joke. Even Grandpa, seated in his large wooden chair like a king at the center of his domain, looked more guarded than joyful, his wrinkled hands gripping his cane tightly whenever someone leaned in to speak with him. His eyes would shift, darting from one relative to another, as if he was watching, waiting, measuring every move. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that maybe it was just me overthinking, maybe I was caught up in the sentimentality of seeing him at such an old age, maybe I was nervous about all the extended relatives I rarely saw. But when I took a closer look, I realized my husband's hand on mine was tense, almost rigid, as if he felt it too. His eyes scanned the room differently from mine, analytical, calculating, like he was piecing together a puzzle from small, scattered clues. As the party went on, I began noticing odd details that unsettled me further. Some of the cousins avoided eye contact with certain uncles, others whispered in corners and fell silent the moment anyone drew near. The air felt divided. Not celebratory, but suspiciously careful, as if everyone was walking on a thin line of politeness to avoid triggering something explosive. Even the music, cheerful as it was, didn't match the undertone I felt growing with every passing minute. I found myself scanning the room the way my husband did, picking up on tiny gestures, the way my aunt's smile faded the second Grandpa looked away, the hushed conversation between my brother and my father that stopped abruptly when I approached. The way the family lawyer, yes, even he had been invited, hovered near the cake table, speaking softly with my older cousins as if discussing something far removed from the spirit of the evening. Grandpa's chair was positioned in the middle of the living room, where all could see him, like a throne. Every guest who approached had the same routine: lean in, shake his hand, force a compliment, and then quickly step back, as though proximity to him was both an honor and a burden. There was no genuine ease, no warmth you'd expect from children and grandchildren celebrating a patriarch's long life. It was stiff, rehearsed, and tinged with unease. The entire room seemed to be built on invisible fault lines, and though I didn't know what those lines were, I could feel that something was bound to crack open. I walked toward the kitchen at one point to fetch drinks, and even there the tension was thick. The women whispered as they stirred pots and plated food, exchanging sharp glances that spoke volumes without words. I caught fragments, phrases about money, land, papers, and every time I neared them, they hushed up and smiled as though nothing had been said. I forced myself to smile back, but the chill that ran through me was undeniable. Returning to the main room, I watched Grandpa raise his glass during a toast. His voice, though frail, carried strength, and for a brief moment it felt like the unity I had longed for. He spoke about family, about endurance, about the sacrifices he had made for us all. But when he paused and his eyes lingered on certain people, the silence stretched too long again, and I noticed the stiffness return to the room. The cheer that should have erupted after his words was delayed, awkward, as if everyone was calculating the proper reaction before clapping. Children, blissfully unaware, darted around the living room with balloons, laughing and shrieking, their joy standing in sharp contrast to the rigid bodies of adults lined against the walls. Their innocence made the rest of us look even more suspicious, even more locked in whatever invisible battle had been staged behind closed doors. It was in those moments I realized this wasn't just a party, it was something else. A stage, perhaps. A gathering not just to celebrate but to witness, to watch, to maneuver. And as much as I wanted to deny it, the atmosphere had shifted into something darker. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid, that I should simply enjoy the night, but the unease was undeniable. My husband's silence beside me wasn't the silence of relaxation, it was the silence of someone bracing for impact. The uneasiness built layer by layer, and I found myself clinging to the idea that maybe I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew better. The air was charged, not with joy but with hidden motives, concealed truths, and secrets that everyone seemed to know except me. I didn't understand it yet, but something about that night was going to change everything. When my husband leaned closer to me in the middle of the party, the sound of his voice did not match the celebration around us. The room was filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and the hum of conversation, but his words sliced through all of it, quiet and deliberate. He said we were leaving, and his tone carried no trace of hesitation. His grip on my hand was firm, steady, as though he had already decided on something I had not yet been told. I looked at him, confused, trying to search his face for context, but all I found was a seriousness that felt out of place in a room full of relatives smiling at Grandpa's milestone. His eyes were sharp, moving from one corner of the room to the next, and it was clear he was seeing things I wasn't. My instinct was to protest, to remind him that this was Grandpa's 90th birthday, that leaving would look strange and disrespectful, that everyone would question why we slipped away from such a once-in-a-lifetime occasion. But before I could say anything, he leaned closer again, his lips barely moving, and whispered that something was very, very wrong. The words hit me harder than I expected. He was not a man who dramatized things. He was calm, rational, often skeptical when I worried too much. If he was saying something was wrong, it meant he had already pieced together evidence, subtle signs that had escaped me. I followed his gaze across the room, trying to see what he saw. My uncle stood near the fireplace, shifting uncomfortably as he spoke in low tones with the family lawyer. Two cousins were whispering to each other at the edge of the buffet table, their faces tight and anxious, eyes darting in Grandpa's direction. My aunt, who had always been warm and inviting, was unusually stiff, her smile more of a mask than an expression. It was as though the more I looked, the more I began to notice cracks in the illusion of celebration. Still, I struggled to understand what could possibly warrant such a grave warning. This was family. Yes, there were long-standing tensions and old resentments, but those were common at any gathering. Birthdays, weddings, holidays, they always brought out a mix of joy and rivalry. But the urgency in my husband's voice told me this was different. He squeezed my hand again, subtly, a silent reminder not to draw attention to us. It was his way of saying, watch, don't react, stay alert. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he told me to trust him, that leaving early might be the only way to protect ourselves from what was coming. His vague response unsettled me even more, because he wasn't a man of half-statements. If he wasn't telling me the details, it was because he believed saying them aloud could either expose us or put us at greater risk. That silence spoke louder than any explanation could have. As the evening stretched on, I began to catch the smallest of details, the way Grandpa's toast had been met with strained smiles rather than genuine cheer, the sudden shift in conversation whenever I or my husband drew near, the subtle but unmistakable tension surrounding the lawyer's presence at what should have been a simple family birthday. And when I looked back at Grandpa himself, I noticed his hands trembling more than usual, not from age, but from something closer to fear or frustration. His eyes flickered with a kind of alertness, scanning his own family the way my husband had been scanning the room. Every smile looked fake, every laugh sounded hollow, and every conversation carried the possibility of hidden meaning. I found myself clinging to his side, matching his silence, watching the same way he did, piecing together fragments of a truth I wasn't ready to face, but knew was there, lurking just beneath the surface. The longer I stayed at the party, the more I noticed that the people I had grown up around, family I thought I knew well, were behaving in ways that unsettled me. At first, it seemed like the usual awkwardness that comes with large gatherings, but as the minutes stretched on, the strangeness became undeniable. I began to see the patterns that my husband had sensed almost immediately, and once I caught on to them, I couldn't unsee them. Certain relatives avoided each other entirely, like my two cousins who used to be inseparable as kids, but now couldn't even share the same space without stiffening. They kept their distance, pretending to be busy with different groups, though their eyes often betrayed them, darting across the room only to quickly look away when they accidentally locked gazes. My uncle, usually loud and boisterous at any family event, was uncharacteristically quiet. He stood with his drink pressed too tightly against his chest, speaking only in clipped sentences when someone addressed him, and his smile never quite fit the situation. It wasn't just silence or avoidance, it was the whispering. Everywhere I turned, people seemed to be leaning too close to one another, voices hushed, eyes shifting nervously around as if making sure no one else overheard. When I tried to approach, their conversation stopped abruptly, replaced by polite small talk or forced laughter. I caught fragments that didn't fit the celebration, mentions of documents, of decisions, of timing, of things that had nothing to do with the birthday party. Every time I heard something, my chest tightened because it painted a picture I wasn't ready to acknowledge. Even the way people looked at Grandpa was unusual. Normally, his birthday would have been a time to shower him with affection, to make him feel like the center of the family. But instead, their glances were brief, almost calculating, as though they were weighing something about him rather than celebrating him. When he spoke, their responses felt stiff, rehearsed, lacking the warmth that used to flow so easily between him and the rest of us. There was respect, yes, but it was laced with something else, tension, maybe resentment, maybe fear. I found myself studying Grandpa too, wondering if he noticed the same things. His eyes, sharp despite his age, scanned the room constantly. He would nod politely when someone greeted him, but his gaze always lingered just a second too long afterward, as though he was searching for the truth behind their words. At times, his fingers tapped against the armrest of his chair, not out of impatience, but out of habit, a rhythm that betrayed a restless mind. I knew that look. It was the look of someone who was fully aware that he was surrounded not only by family, but by agendas. As the night went on, I realized that even the laughter carried a strange edge. It would rise too quickly, too loudly, and then die off just as fast, like everyone was overcompensating for the tension that pressed in on all sides. I caught my aunt giving a sharp glance at her husband after he told a joke, her eyes flashing a warning I didn't understand. I saw my brother excuse himself from the table mid-conversation, slipping out to the patio to make a phone call he thought no one noticed. I watched my cousins pretend to play with the kids, but their eyes weren't on the balloons or the games, they were locked on the lawyer again, who seemed to drift in and out of groups with unsettling ease, his face neutral, unreadable. The longer I stayed, the more suffocating it became. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, that I was influenced by my husband's warning, but it wasn't just me anymore. The energy in the room was undeniable, and every small action only reinforced it. No one was truly relaxed. No one was truly celebrating. The air carried the same weight as a courtroom just before a verdict is read, a quiet anticipation that something irreversible was about to be revealed. I thought about the family history, about the conflicts and grudges that had simmered over the years, and I began to wonder if those old wounds had come back to the surface in ways I couldn't yet see. In a family like ours, with property, money, and legacies tied up in every conversation, it wasn't hard to imagine that celebrations could double as battlefields. The party that looked like a tribute to Grandpa's life might actually have been the perfect cover for discussions, negotiations, or betrayals that had been building for months. Everywhere I looked, I saw secrets written across faces I had once trusted without question. Their voices were lower, their movements sharper, their smiles thinner. And every time my husband's hand tightened around mine, it reminded me that I wasn't imagining it, that he had seen all of this long before I caught on. The whispers weren't just idle chatter, the hidden glances weren't just coincidences, and the strange silences weren't just awkward pauses. Something was being concealed, something significant, and it was pulsing beneath the surface of what should have been one of the happiest nights of Grandpa's life. The night had already begun to feel strange, but the truth started to unravel when I pieced together the fragments of conversations and the uneasy looks that seemed to follow every word spoken. At first, I thought it was only tension, family politics showing themselves on a night when everyone should have been united, but the deeper I looked, the more I realized there was something buried, something none of them wanted to admit in the open. It started with the lawyer's presence, a detail that refused to leave my mind. Who brings a lawyer to a 90th birthday? He wasn't sitting to eat or laugh with the others. He wasn't carrying himself like a guest. He was there for business, and the way people gravitated toward him, whispering and nodding, confirmed that his role was more than casual. Grandpa's voice had carried so much weight when he toasted earlier, but now I thought about the words he had chosen. He spoke of endurance, of sacrifices, of family loyalty, and when I replayed it in my head, I realized it sounded less like a celebration and more like a reminder. It was as though he knew that not everyone in that room truly came to honor him. Some came for what he still represented, for what he still controlled, for what his presence still held together. Grandpa was more than just the man at the head of the family. He was the key to something larger, something the others were circling around like vultures. I tried to dismiss the thought, but then I caught sight of papers being quietly handed from one cousin to another. They folded them too quickly, slipping them into purses or pockets as though they couldn't risk being seen. My aunt's sharp tone when she scolded her husband for speaking too loudly carried more than just irritation. It carried the urgency of someone desperate to keep a secret contained. I began listening harder, straining to pick up the words that drifted past the surface chatter. I heard references to deeds, to signatures, to promises broken long ago. It wasn't about the party anymore. It was about land, about inheritance, about decisions being made while Grandpa was still alive to be influenced. The betrayal settled into me slowly, like a chill creeping up my spine. I had always believed in the closeness of family, in the ties that bound us together, but what I was witnessing was not love, it was maneuvering. My husband's whispered warning began to make more sense. He had seen it long before I did, seen the way relatives circled Grandpa not out of respect, but out of greed. The celebration was only a cover, a stage for something darker, the unveiling of a truth that had been hidden from me and perhaps from many others. I looked at Grandpa again, wondering if he knew what was happening. His eyes, sharp and deliberate, told me he did. He wasn't simply the honored guest of the evening, he was the target. Every handshake, every whispered word, every nervous glance circled back to him, to what he still held, to what everyone else desperately wanted a piece of. And that was when the weight of it all began to sink in. This wasn't just tension, this was a battle disguised as a birthday party. The more I observed, the clearer it became. My brother avoided Grandpa's gaze, unable to hold it for more than a moment, as though guilt was pressing down on him. My cousin's laughter was shallow, dying the second they thought no one was listening. My uncle lingered near the lawyer, his face pale and tight, nodding as though being given instructions he didn't entirely agree with but couldn't refuse. My aunt wrung her hands whenever she passed by Grandpa's chair, her smile stretched so thin it looked painful. None of this looked like celebration. It looked like a performance, a carefully crafted illusion to hide the darker reality playing out in plain sight. I remembered the fragments I had overheard in the kitchen earlier, words about papers, about timing, and suddenly, they all fit together. This wasn't just about a party. It was about seizing control, about using the distraction of a milestone birthday to push through something that would affect the entire family's future. The betrayal wasn't just in their actions, but in the deceit, in how they dressed it up as love and celebration while quietly tearing apart the very foundation Grandpa had built over 90 long years. The more I thought about it, the more the atmosphere shifted. Every smile became suspicious, every laugh sounded hollow, and every toast felt like a mask hiding venom beneath. The betrayal was not open yet, but it was there, simmering beneath every word, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. My husband's grip on my hand reminded me again that he had sensed this long before I had. He knew the truth wasn't going to stay hidden much longer, and when it finally came to light, it would not be gentle. That night, I stood in a room full of people I had once trusted, people I had called family, and realized they were not there for Grandpa, They were there for themselves. They were circling around him, not to honor his years, but to pick apart the legacy he still guarded. The betrayal was deeper than I could have imagined. The moment that confirmed it came quietly, almost too quietly, when I caught my brother in the hallway. He was on his phone, his voice hushed but tense, his back turned slightly as if he hoped no one would notice. He didn't see me at first, but when I approached, his entire body stiffened. He hung up too quickly, his excuse fumbling and weak, and his eyes darted away from mine. I knew that look. It was the look of someone who had been caught, someone whose guilt was too fresh to disguise. I wanted to confront him, to demand answers, but the heaviness in my chest told me I wouldn't get the truth. Not there, not in that moment. When I returned to the main room, I saw my husband watching me carefully, his eyes asking if I was starting to understand. I gave him the smallest nod, because the pieces were aligning in ways I could no longer deny. The celebration was nothing more than a mask, and behind it was betrayal so blatant it made my stomach churn. Grandpa's legacy, his property, his life's work, it was all being torn apart right under his nose, or perhaps right before his eyes. And the worst part was knowing that those doing it weren't strangers or outsiders. They were family. I thought back on the years of gatherings, of birthdays and holidays, of dinners where we sat around the same table. I thought about the laughter we once shared, the secrets we exchanged in confidence, the promises that family was forever. All of it suddenly felt hollow, rewritten by the reality I was facing now. They weren't here to honor him, they were here to divide him, to take pieces of him while he was still alive to watch it happen. And that realization broke something in me that I couldn't easily repair. The betrayal forced a choice upon me. Staying meant playing along with the illusion, pretending I hadn't seen what I had seen, letting myself be swallowed by their schemes until I was complicit. Leaving meant stepping out, separating myself from them, and protecting what little trust one still had left, with my husband, with myself. When he whispered that we had to go, I no longer argued. I understood. He wasn't only protecting me, he was protecting us from being dragged into a web of greed that could destroy everything in its path. As I looked around the room one last time, I noticed how quickly they avoided my gaze. My uncle shifted his eyes, my cousins busied themselves with meaningless chatter, my aunt fussed with the cake. No one wanted to meet me head-on, because they knew on some level that I was starting to see through them. Their avoidance wasn't casual, it was deliberate, a defense against being confronted. And in that realization, I felt the deepest sting of betrayal. It wasn't only about Grandpa or his legacy. It was about the way they treated me too, as though I could be fooled, as though I wouldn't notice, as though my silence was guaranteed. The weight of it all built up until the celebration itself became unbearable. The music was too loud, the laughter too forced, the decorations too bright for a night so heavy with hidden motives. I realized then that betrayal doesn't always arrive with shouting or confrontation. Sometimes it creeps in quietly, hidden in whispered conversations, in folded papers exchanged under the table, in glances that linger too long. And when you finally see it, when you finally recognize it, there is no way to unsee it. My husband's hand never left mine, and in that grip was an anchor, a lifeline, a way out. He didn't need to say anything more. His silence told me he knew how dangerous it was to stay any longer, how staying meant allowing ourselves to be caught in a storm we didn't create. I looked at Grandpa again, at the way his eyes moved across the room, and I wondered if he had expected this, if he had known all along that his birthday would be the day when the truth started to slip through the cracks. The pain in his gaze told me he understood better than anyone what was happening, but the strength in it told me he would not let it pass unnoticed. Leaving wasn't only about walking out of a party. It was about walking away from the lies that threatened to entangle us. It was about refusing to stand there and smile while the people I once trusted turned something sacred into something poisoned. It was about saving myself from drowning in their betrayal, because once I saw it, I knew that staying meant letting it consume me too.